Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday Edition. This morning we're talking about the first year of the Trump presidency since he was elected a year ago this past month. Our guests this morning are from the Robert Morris University, Dr. Philip Harold, he's professor of political science, and also Dr. Simon Hayter, he's assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at West Virginia University's John D. Rockefeller IV School of Policy and Politics. Simon, a moment ago you mentioned the fact that West Virginia has changed, and you also mentioned earlier that when I asked about whether the president has won over Republicans, you both felt that he has changed the party to a degree. Things have gone really well in some areas. The stock market has exploded, 6,000-point move since he was elected. He has followed through on some of his promises, whether they on deregulation, NAFTA, some other things. He's at least made these efforts to do that. We already mentioned about moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem in Israel. What about overall for the American people? Is he just solidifying Republicans to behind him, or is he broadening his total base with Democrats as well, or independents?
I see. I think the Trump administration is really shifting away from trying to win over Democrats that are minority voters, that are college educated in a way, and they're shifting towards just solidifying the base, bringing out working class white Americans, which in the long run obviously is a problem. That's a shrinking number of Americans. More minorities are taking over in a lot of states, and so in the long run, you kind of setting yourself up for failure if you're only playing to that very narrow base of white working Americans and potentially some very rich people. But that's not the majority of the country right now, and it's not going to be the majority in a few years for sure.
Phil?
Right. Well, clearly, if you look at opinion polls, he's not running his base. I mean, he's gotten unrelenting negative press coverage, so maybe that's not too surprising. In the midterm election coming up 2018, I mean, the rule of American politics is the party of the president really gets hammered in the midterm election. So we'll probably see some losses there. Now, the nice thing for Republicans is the House districts are really gerrymandered, and the Senate map overwhelmingly favors Republicans. There's a real cushion there because there's 10 Democrats who are in states that Trump won that have to defend their seats, including here in Pennsylvania with Bob Casey. So he has a little bit of a cushion. It's about the election, not the opinion polls, as the last election showed. So I think, in the first year, you don't want, maybe broadening the base comes a little later, maybe in the term. I mean, I do think that's very important for Republicans. I think minority outrage is critical for the party. We haven't seen so much of that in the first year. We've seen things like the tax bill, which, at least in the proposals, really is punishing blue states with the limiting the mortgage deduction and the state and local tax deduction.
Well, you brought 2018. So you don't believe that he will be facing anything like Bill Clinton faced in '94 when we had the contract with America, Newt Gingrich, and they changed the House around?
2018 could not be more favorable for Republicans, particularly in the Senate, as you mentioned. I mean, Democrats have to play defense. They have to maintain West Virginia, which is incredibly challenging with Joe Manchin. They have to maintain Pennsylvania. It's going to be really, really hard. House, I'm pretty sure Democrats are going to pick up some seats. If Democrats were to take over one of the chambers, it would be dramatic, and it would be a big repudiation of what the Trump administration is doing, because gerrymandering and the way the Senate map's shaping up, that would just be a massive failure for Republicans to carry through.
But you don't see that happening?
Well, it's too soon to tell, but it would also play, I mean, if that did happen, that would play to the cycles of what's expected. But anything can kind of happen. I mean, the only time a party has taken back the Senate, for instance, in a midterm, was right after 9/11. So there could be some revelation, there could be some event that could switch things around. We'll see if there's a blue wave. I mean, Democratic voters don't like Trump, and they're fired up to vote in the mid. So that's what typically happens in midterms.
My question is maybe more sociology than political science, but here we have a president in office that many people think is really off the rails. I mean, the red-hot hatred for him has been immense. And it's been normalized in the way that a frog is slowly boiled in water, doesn't realize it's being boiled. And have people who hated Trump so intensely worn out? Have you noticed that people are like, well, we're stuck with him, what are we going to do? You know, how do you?
I haven't noticed that. Have you noticed that?
I haven't, but there's always a danger, right? We had this. I used to be in the University of Wisconsin. We had this issue with Scott Walker when he was, fighting unions. People were really, really upset. But by the time he finally got through the recall, he still won. Massive influx of cash. People got tired of all this kind of stuff. Yeah, so there's a danger that could happen.
Yeah, I mean, but people talk of normalizing, and then he gives things to certain groups. People who are like, I'm furious, furious, furious. You know what? Actually, move the embassy to Jerusalem. About time. And so, bit by bit, you get a little thing from tax, a little bit here, but it does remain that when people talk about him in office, it's who has the plan to keep him away from the nuclear button? And these are rational people talking about that, about our president.
I think two interesting things are happening. We see a lot of Republican members of Congress retiring, which is usually, from political science perspective, an indication that they think they have a hard time winning their next election, because it's a lot better to say you retired than you lost your last election, right? And we're also seeing a massive number of women running for office and filing to run for office in the next election. And I think those are good indicators that there could be something brewing like Bill Clinton faced in his first midterm election. Interesting.
The other thing that's being mentioned by those who really do not like this president very much is the I word, and that is impeachment. From the Brookings Institute, Elaine Camark wrote this, and that basically he has record low approval ratings for this point in any presidency in the modern era, and he has already provoked discussions of impeachment. A mere 4 months into Trump's term, and the I word was already in play. Is it in play?
No, it's not in play unless something dramatic happens. I think the Mueller investigation, the Russia investigation, how that turns out will play into him being normalized and people more getting used to it. But I haven't seen that happening yet.
Yeah, I'd be surprised. It seems Republicans are very comfortable protecting their majorities and protecting a Republican president. We've seen this with the Alabama Senate race, where Republicans at first were really upset about, the allegations, and now of kind of spending money. The Republican campaign is spending money there. So I think if Republicans maintain their majorities, they're happy to work with the president in implementing their policy goals. The only way we could eventually get to impeachment possibly is if Democrats take over the House. But Democrats also benefit, I think, if they see that they can win with the Trump president. It's nice to have kind of scapegoat and someone working against you, which might be beneficial.
It's a reason. There's a reason to vote for us if you keep him in office. In other words, is basically what you're saying. You mentioned a lot of senators or congressmen are retiring because they might feel they might be in jeopardy. We've also had some retirements or resignations now over this whole Me Too aspect that's going on, and there are many who feel that this president is one who should be resigning as well because of allegations of sexual harassment. Where does this, how far will this go? Will it eventually envelop him as well?
I don't think so. I mean, I think when this, could be wrong, but when the spotlight is on you, you have more of an incentive for good behavior. And that, there's the past allegations, like in the Roy Moore instance, it was 30 years ago. So, it's the voters are going to make the decision on that one. But anything can happen with new revelations, and certainly with Bill Clinton, that happened to him.
Right. Well, the thing with Moore and most of the people who have resigned, whether it be Conyers or Franken or Trent Frank, I think it is, from New Mexico, the allegations happened when they were in office, and even more because he was district attorney in Alabama at that point. The allegations against the president are before he became president. Is there a line? Is there a difference as to how that should be handled?
I think it's certainly more concerning. It's always concerning, but it's certainly more concerning if you're a person in power, in public office. I think we're more concerned. Americans are more concerned if you do that kind of stuff. I think the only thing anything happens with the Trump administration in this regard is if maybe a video comes out that's more explicit than the one we had during the campaign. But even then, his supporters seem to feel there's the media is in cahoots with Democrats to just find something on this president. It's made up. It's fake news.
It's factored in. It all came out before the election, and he got elected.
Right.
And it seems to just fire them up even more and love this president even more. And so,
we started off when we began the program, and that has he changed what the presidency is supposed to look like? I mean, because that's one of the big criticisms when he first took office is, well, he doesn't seem presidential. Are we now just accepting that this is the way it's going to be?
Well, we'll have to see, right, what the next president does and how this kind of turns out. But it's certainly different. The tweeting stuff, the actions, the words he uses, how bold he is in making proclamations and all those kind of things. It certainly splits the country in half, I think. There's a good number of people that love the president. They love what he's doing, going directly to the people. You know, they're very much in favor of his actions and they love what he's doing. But there's a large part of the country, I think probably the larger part, that is concerned about the dignity of the office and what that does.
Would that hold true for the people in West Virginia who now, as you indicated, don't like Democrats much at all anymore?
I think the vast majority of West Virginians are very much in favor of what he's doing. He's taking back the country. He's listening to people like them. He's one of them in many ways, which is startling because he's a millionaire, right?
Billionaire.
So if he's, where I want to go with this is because you mentioned about the tweets. He's the first one who's really used that social media to the realm that he was able to do. Has that now all changed in how someone is elected? Do you see that happening on the Congressional Senate side, all this sort of thing?
Well, I think, I think the next president after Trump will probably do something similar on Twitter, perhaps. I mean, he's really found a way to communicate directly with people, which is what presidents like to do, go over the head of Congress, appeal directly to people,
and
all the way back to Andy Jackson, and control kind of the conversation and shape the dialogue with early morning tweets. So when we look back, I think that will have been a shift. And it's because it's authentic, it's because we think that it's him. I mean, nobody thinks that it's a staffer writing these tweets.
Except when it's convenient for him.
Except the latest one where the lawyer claimed, oh, that was me, actually.
That was me, actually. Right. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this morning on the KDPG Sunday Edition. John, I'll be back with some final thoughts in just a moment.